The air hangs heavy with smoke and silence. A town once filled with voices now breathes only dust. Windows are shattered, roofs gone, walls burned black. The sound of boots and engines echoes faintly from beyond the hills. The Americans are coming. In a damp cellar beneath the ruins, a mother clutches her 2 children. The youngest, a boy of 6, whispers the same question he's asked all morning. Will they hurt us? She doesn't answer. The leaflets dropped days earlier promised safety for those who surrendered, but every rumor said otherwise. That the Allies would take revenge for every bombed city, every fallen son. Outside, a handful of old men and frightened women wait by the roadside, white cloths trembling in their hands. Their faces are gray with fear, not from hunger alone, but from the unknown. Through the mist, armored silhouettes appear, olive-drab tanks rolling slowly past smoking barns. The soldiers' eyes meet the civilians'. No words, just years of hate and exhaustion in a single glance. And then, something unexpected happens. The first American climbs down from his jeep and reaches into his pocket. The collapse of a nation by the spring of 1945. Germany was no longer a country, it was a ruin stretched between rivers. The Rhine had been crossed. The Siegfried Line had fallen. Allied divisions, hardened by years of attrition, were moving east through towns that barely existed anymore. Behind them, the bridges of France stood in the rain. Before them, the spires of the Reich smoldered against a gray horizon. Hitler still broadcast from the depths of his Berlin bunker, insisting the miracle weapons would turn the tide. But the miracles had burned out. The Luftwaffe was a ghost. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable across Europe, now retreated through mud and rubble. Entire regiments were reduced to boys in Hitler Youth armbands, clutching Panzerfausts they could barely lift. For the Allies, the crossing into Germany was more than a military push. It was a moral test. The propaganda of 6 years had painted the German heartland as the engine of terror. Every bombed village in England, every corpse at Buchenwald, every letter from a fallen comrade whispered one message: do not forgive. And yet, as American GIs marched past the Rhine and into enemy soil, what they saw was not defiance, but devastation. Roads were filled with refugees, women, children, and the elderly pulling carts piled with bedding and broken furniture. Livestock wandered freely, unclaimed. The men who remained were too old to fight or too young to understand why they had to. Town after town surrendered without a shot. White flags hung from church towers, from windows, from the ends of broomsticks. Still, suspicion lingered. Behind every curtain could be a sniper. In every cellar, a hidden SS man ready to die for a lost cause. The U.S. Army advanced cautiously, rifles raised, nerves on edge. In the mess tents, soldiers spoke in low voices about what they'd found in liberated camps just days earlier. Skeletal prisoners, mass graves, the inhuman scale of what had been done in the name of the Reich. The fury was fresh, almost unbearable, and yet by the time they reached the heart of Germany, that rage began to fade into exhaustion. It was not victory they felt, but weariness. Years of mud, cold, and loss had drained the idea of revenge. Many soldiers simply wanted to go home, to finish the war, not to prolong its cruelty. The German civilians, on the other hand, lived in a fog of dread. Nazi propaganda had promised that Allied troops would burn, pillage, and kill indiscriminately. Mothers whispered warnings to their children. Some prepared poison rather than face occupation. But when the first American units entered the bomb-scarred villages, they did not bring fire. They brought silence and caution. The two worlds stared at each other through the dust, conqueror and conquered, both equally tired of death. And in that fragile pause between vengeance and mercy, history hesitated. Between ruin and redemption across Germany in the spring of 1945, the war was collapsing not just militarily but humanly. Entire cities lay flattened. Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg, Munich. Each was a landscape of smoke and rubble. In Berlin, thousands lived in the underground stations, afraid to come up for air. In the countryside, the sound of artillery was a constant reminder that time itself was running out. Civilians moved like shadows along the roads, refugees from the east, fleeing the Red Army's advance. They carried stories of vengeance so terrifying that many preferred to surrender to the Americans or British. The Western Front, though brutal, carried a faint rumor of restraint. People whispered that the Americans feed prisoners, that they treat civilians kindly, but no one truly knew. In March, General Eisenhower had issued strict orders. German civilians were not to be harmed. Looting and mistreatment were forbidden. The Allied war was to be fought with discipline, not hatred. Still, for soldiers who had seen the camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Ohrdruf, that restraint was not automatic. Some had stared into the open pits of death only days before, and now had to look into the eyes of those who had lived under the same flag that made it possible. Moral clarity became a battlefield of its own. The front lines were no longer drawn on maps, but within the conscience of every man holding a rifle. Many American units began to see the civilian population not as enemies, but as survivors of the same machine that had consumed Europe. The Nazis had promised them a 1,000-year empire. Instead, they delivered ruin. Townspeople emerged from basements in disbelief, their first words not defiance but apology. Mothers offered the last of their bread to soldiers who refused to take it. In countless towns, the encounters followed a pattern. White flags raised, doors opening cautiously. Then the first contact, often a child stepping forward before the adults dared to. Children always hungry, always fearless. For many soldiers, that was the moment when the war shifted. A chocolate bar, a can of rations, a cigarette. Small gestures that said more than any victory speech. Food became a language of peace. To a child who hadn't tasted sugar in years, chocolate was more than candy. It was the taste of safety, of something human returning to a world that had forgotten it. These small acts were not commanded. They were spontaneous, born of a deep exhaustion with killing. Yet their effect rippled far beyond the battlefield. Civilians who had expected revenge now saw mercy, and soldiers who had come prepared to fight found themselves comforting the defeated. Still, not all moments were gentle. In some places, the lines blurred. Looting occurred. Prisoners were mistreated. The chaos of occupation carried its own shadows. But the overall pattern, especially in the western zones, was one of surprising restraint. War correspondents who traveled with the Allied forces noted the same contradiction everywhere. Destruction and kindness living side by side. Houses still smoldered, yet soldiers shared their rations with the people inside them. Churches stood roofless, yet bells were rung when the firing stopped. By late April, it was clear that Germany's military defeat was inevitable, but what remained uncertain was the moral legacy that would follow. Would the victors repeat the cycle of vengeance that had fueled the war in the first place? Or would they end it with something different? That question, unspoken yet heavy, traveled with every soldier who entered a silent German street. And as they did, they began to see the enemy was no longer a uniform. It was hunger, fear, and the memory of what hate could do. From that realization would emerge one of the quietest yet most powerful moments of the entire war. When, in a town reduced to ashes, mercy overcame bitterness. The human angle. Faces in the rubble to understand April 1945. One must look not at the flags but at the faces. The German civilians who watched the American columns approach were not the fanatics of propaganda posters. Most were mothers, grandfathers, and children, exhausted, starved, hollow-eyed from sleepless nights spent in basements. For months they had lived under a sky that never stopped falling bombs. The world they had known, schools, markets, neighbors, had turned into ruins and ashes. They were told that the Allied soldiers were monsters who would take revenge, who would destroy everything left. But when the tanks finally arrived, what came out of them were not monsters, just young men with mud on their boots, many barely older than the boys hiding behind cellar doors. The civilians' first emotion was disbelief, then relief, then shame. Many wept silently as the Americans passed. They had feared violence and instead found restraint. It was the first time in years that fear itself began to fade, replaced by something fragile and unfamiliar: safety. The soldier's perspective. Between orders and conscience, for the American infantryman, the end of the war was not a triumphant march. It was a slow, surreal exhaustion. The long journey from Normandy through France, the Ardennes, and into Germany had stripped away every illusion of glory. Most soldiers had seen too much: comrades lost in hedgerows, villages burned, bodies frozen in snow. The war had taught them one truth: victory never looked like the posters. By 1945, the average U.S. soldier advancing into Germany was 19 or 20 years old. Many had never been outside their home state before the war. They entered German towns expecting fanatical resistance, ambushes, or booby traps. Instead, they found hungry families. Children stared at them with hollow eyes, not defiance. The soldiers' first instinct was suspicion. The second was pity. For many, the sight of German children was disarming. It erased the years of hatred taught by propaganda on both sides. Some remembered their own siblings back home. Others recalled how their rations, Hershey bars, canned beans, powdered milk, suddenly felt heavier in their packs when they saw starving faces. These small moments of empathy were not heroic in the traditional sense, but they were acts of quiet courage. To show mercy in war requires a kind of bravery that no medal can recognize. And as those soldiers began sharing what little they had, they discovered something few had expected. Kindness was contagious. The moral angle. The battle that never made headlines. In every war, there is a moment when the guns grow silent, but the struggle continues within the human heart. For the Allies, that internal battle was as defining as any fought on the front. They had witnessed atrocities so severe that forgiveness seemed impossible. Yet in the ruins of Germany, they faced a choice that would shape not only the end of the war but the moral foundation of what came after, to punish or to rebuild. To hate or to heal, those were not political questions. They were deeply human ones. Eisenhower's command to treat civilians with respect was not merely strategy, it was principle. The Allies had to prove that their victory was not just military, but moral. They could not defeat fascism by becoming what they fought against. And so, amid the rubble, moments of moral clarity began to appear like small lights in the fog of war. A medic dressing a wounded German child. A soldier refusing to loot a house because we didn't come here to steal. A captain ordering food distribution before celebration. These gestures went largely unrecorded, but they carried immense power. They marked the beginning of what historians would later call the moral occupation, a conscious effort to end a war of hate with acts of humanity. It was here, in the tension between rage and compassion, that the true meaning of victory emerged, not in conquest but in restraint, and that restraint would soon manifest itself in a gesture so small it seemed almost trivial, a piece of chocolate extended to a trembling child. The leadership angle. Orders that defined mercy victory in 1945 did not happen by chance, and neither did compassion. Behind the quiet acts of mercy shown by American soldiers stood a chain of command that understood the weight of history. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was acutely aware that how the Allies treated Germany in defeat would shape Europe's next century. His orders were clear. The enemy was beaten, not annihilated. Looting was forbidden. Civilians were to be respected. Food, when available, was to be shared. Eisenhower knew the world was watching, and so were the Germans. The difference between occupation and liberation, he once said, is conduct. American commanders understood that every handshake, every meal shared, every restraint shown was a message to the future. The U.S. Army was not there to mirror the Reich's cruelty, but to end the cycle that had fueled it. Even amid logistical chaos, bridges gone, supply lines stretched thin, discipline held firm. The orders were not always obeyed perfectly. There were moments of vengeance, isolated brutality, or chaos. But the broader truth remained. The American occupation began with one of the most restrained transitions of power in modern warfare. It was the start of something that would later be known as the martial spirit, the idea that peace must be built, not imposed. From Eisenhower's headquarters to the smallest village checkpoint, that principle filtered down through ranks and hearts, and it found its purest expression not in speeches, but in gestures, like the one that would soon unfold in a small, nameless town. The cultural angle, the taste of humanity in the 1940s. Chocolate was more than food. It was an emblem of home. Every U.S. soldier carried it, either as part of their rations or as a small comfort from loved ones. The Hershey Company had produced over 1 billion chocolate bars for the war effort. Packing them into khaki wrappers marked Ration D or Field Bar. They were designed for endurance, not enjoyment, but they still symbolized something precious. To a soldier, That chocolate bar meant warmth, family, normal life. To a starving German child, it meant survival. When those worlds collided, the act of sharing chocolate became far more than generosity. It was the transfer of peace itself, a silent acknowledgement that the war was truly over. Across Germany, countless small scenes echoed the same pattern: a nervous child, a cautious soldier, and a simple exchange that broke through the debris of propaganda. For historians, it became a symbol of reconciliation, but for those who lived it, it was a memory that lingered for decades. In post-war interviews, many elderly Germans recalled that the first American gave me chocolate. They could not remember his name or face, only the taste. Sweet, fragile, and impossibly human after years of fear. No command could have planned that. It was the result of individual conscience, of young men who chose to end the war with kindness rather than triumph. And in doing so, they restored something that the Reich had stolen: the belief that compassion could exist even in uniform. The enemy angle, recognition beyond defeat. The propaganda of war always reduces the enemy to a shadow, faceless, nameless, monstrous. But when the U.S. troops entered the heart of Germany, that illusion collapsed. The enemy was no longer an idea. It was a person, frail, frightened, human. Many soldiers described the moment as disorienting. They had been trained to fight a machine, not to face the people who lived beneath it. Seeing German civilians suffer, seeing the hunger and grief mirrored in their own memories, forced a reckoning. For some, it was unsettling. They had lost brothers to German bullets. Compassion felt like betrayal. But for others, it was a form of victory, the final proof that they had not become what they fought. When a soldier reached out with food, he wasn't forgiving ideology. He was recognizing humanity, and that recognition spread like quiet wildfire through the ranks. Soon, stories traveled of medics helping German mothers, of GIs sharing cigarettes with old men, of laughter returning in small, hesitant bursts. The German civilians, in turn, began to see their occupiers differently. The same soldiers they had feared became the first faces of freedom. For many, that day marked the true end of the war. Not when the guns went silent, but when they realized that mercy had arrived wearing the uniform of the enemy. That fragile connection, born from exhaustion, discipline, and human instinct, would soon crystallize in one moment. A single act recorded in memory, if not in documents, when the war's brutality gave way to an act of startling gentleness. The town that waited for retribution, April 24th, 1945. Somewhere along the main river valley, between Würzburg and Aschaffenburg, a small German town waited for its fate. The front had passed only a few kilometers away, and now the thunder of artillery had grown distant, replaced by the rhythmic hum of engines. The Americans were near. The town was barely standing. A week of shelling had reduced much of it to rubble. Roof tiles lay shattered in the streets. Smoke still drifted from a row of houses struck during the last night's bombardment. The church spire was broken at its midpoint, the bell hanging sideways like a frozen scream. Inside what remained of the town hall, the mayor, an aging veteran of the Great War, had ordered all men to surrender their weapons. The local Volkssturm unit had already fled, scattering into the forest when word spread that U.S. tanks had crossed the bridge to the west. Only a few stubborn diehards remained, whispering that they would fight to the end. But even they knew the truth. The end had already come. By mid-morning, a strange quiet settled over the streets. Women swept rubble from doorways as if tidying for guests who might destroy them. Children peered from behind broken windows, too young to understand why everyone was whispering. An old man hoisted a makeshift white flag, a bedsheet nailed to a broom handle, and placed it at the crossroads. It fluttered weakly in the wind. At noon they came. From beyond the hill, the metallic clatter of tank treads grew louder. Olive-drab silhouettes emerged through the haze. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and long columns of infantry moving with practiced caution. Helmets low, rifles ready. Dust rose in their wake, mingling with the smoke of the ruined town. The first American unit to enter was a reconnaissance platoon of the 45th Infantry Division. They had seen enough combat to expect the worst. Every doorway could hide a sniper. Every basement could hold an ambush. The men moved slowly, scanning rooftops, their hearts beating fast under layers of grime and fatigue. When they reached the town square, they found it deserted, except for a few trembling figures standing near the fountain. A woman in her 30s, her hands stained with soot, clutched a child to her chest. Beside her, a teenage boy held the reins of a mule, his knuckles white. The lieutenant raised a hand, signaling the column to halt. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of an engine cooling in the spring air. Then the woman stepped forward. She knelt slowly, placing the child on the ground, and raised both hands in surrender. The child, perhaps 6 years old, stared wide-eyed at the soldiers, at the strange uniforms, the alien accents, the blackened muzzles of rifles. The American lieutenant lowered his weapon. He looked at the boy, then at the town behind him, silent and broken. His men waited for orders. He said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. He crouched, extended his hand, and offered it to the child. The boy hesitated. The woman whispered a warning. Propaganda had said these men might poison food. But the lieutenant only smiled faintly, a tired smile, and unwrapped the corner of the paper to show a bar of chocolate. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The boy stepped forward, trembling, and took it. The crowd behind him, neighbors, mothers, elders, unwatched in disbelief. The boy broke a piece, tasted it, and froze. His eyes widened. It was sweet. The reaction was instantaneous. The mother began to cry, not from fear, but from something deeper, older, almost forgotten. Relief. Around the square, the soldiers lowered their weapons. Civilians emerged from doorways. An old woman crossed herself. Someone whispered, "They're not here to kill us." For the first time in years, the air in that town carried not the sound of warring, but the faint, unmistakable sound of people exhaling. The lieutenant turned back to his men and gave a quiet order. "Secure the town. No trouble." And as they spread through the streets, distributing rations, cigarettes, and kindness, the line between enemy and liberator dissolved into something wordless. In that fragile, unplanned moment, mercy had conquered fear. But the story of that day was not over. For what followed, what the soldiers did in the hours after entering that town, would transform a single act of humanity into the defining symbol of how the Western War truly ended. The day the war ended. Without a shot, the boy with the chocolate did not know he was witnessing history. To him, it was simply the first sweet thing he had tasted since the bombing began, a flavor that felt unreal after years of hunger. He clutched the half-eaten bar as if it were treasure, showing it to the others who gathered timidly around him. The American soldiers, watching this unfold, could not help but smile. One of them, a private from Kansas, reached into his pack and pulled out another bar, tossing it gently toward a group of children who had begun to creep out from behind a wagon. Laughter, brittle, uncertain laughter, rippled through the ruins. It was the first sound of joy that town had heard in months. Soon the act repeated itself. More soldiers reached into their pockets, handing out ration biscuits, chewing gum, even the hard candies from first aid kits. The initial silence gave way to murmured thanks. "Danke, danke," spoken through tears and disbelief. The American lieutenant, still standing by the fountain, gave no formal order to stop them. He didn't need to. The war, for his men, had already ended. In the hours that followed, the square filled with people. Old men carried out chairs. Mothers brought buckets of water for the soldiers. A field kitchen was set up near the church, where troops boiled coffee over an open flame. The scent drifted through the air, warm, rich, human. The same smell that had once filled German kitchens before the bombs came. One of the medics, a young corporal from Chicago, began tending to a wounded German child with a bandaged leg. The mother, speechless, stood beside him, holding the medic's hand when he was done. He simply nodded and moved on. No words needed translation. Across the town, white flags hung from every window. Civilians swept the streets. The Americans patrolled without firing a shot. Where there had been terror that morning, there was now something gentler, the faint pulse of normal life returning. For the German people, this mercy felt almost impossible. For years they had lived under a government that ruled through fear, fear of punishment, fear of betrayal, fear of the enemy beyond their borders. And yet in their final defeat they found not cruelty but compassion. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis, and something deeply human had reappeared. Later that evening, As dusk fell over the valley, the townspeople gathered near the church steps. The Americans, still cautious, stood nearby, rifles slung but ready. Then from somewhere in the crowd, a small voice began to sing, a child's voice, hesitant but pure. It was a lullaby, one every mother in Germany knew. Schlaf, Kindlein, schlaf. The song floated through the broken town like a prayer. One by one, other voices joined in. Mothers, fathers, children. The soldiers listened in silence. For many of them, it was the first time in years they had heard a song that wasn't a march or a hymn of war. Some turned away, blinking back tears. When the song ended, there was no applause, only quiet. The lieutenant took off his helmet. The townspeople bowed their heads. No treaties were signed that day. No generals made speeches. But in that small, forgotten town, something sacred happened. The cycle of hatred broke. Historians rarely mention this kind of moment. There are no official records, no coordinates, no battle names to mark it. But among the soldiers who were there, the memory endured. Letters sent home described a town that didn't fight back, children who smiled, and the taste of peace. For many, it was the first time they truly understood what they had been fighting for. Not just to win, but to end. The chocolate, the laughter, the song, they became symbols of a new beginning, fragile but real. When the next division arrived to take over occupation duty, the lieutenant's men moved on toward Bavaria. As they left, townspeople stood along the road waving. Some carried flowers, others simply watched in silence, still unsure if it had all been real. The boy with the chocolate ran beside the jeep until it disappeared beyond the hills. He waved the wrapper like a flag, the American star faintly visible beneath the folds. The war would continue for a few more weeks elsewhere. But for that town on that day, it ended with kindness, not surrender, not victory, but mercy. And though no one knew it then, that quiet transformation, repeated in countless small villages across Germany, would become the moral foundation of the post-war peace that followed. The war's final gunfire was only days away. Yet in the hearts of those who had lived this moment, something much larger had already changed. Because when a soldier offered chocolate instead of revenge, he proved that even at the end of humanity's darkest war, the light had not gone out. Mercy among the ruins. When the war finally ended, it did not end with a cheer. It ended with silence, a silence that hung heavy over the cities and fields of Europe, a silence of smoke, of disbelief, of people too exhausted to celebrate survival. Germany, once the engine of a continent, was now a landscape of rubble and hunger. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden were nothing but twisted skeletons of stone. The roads were crowded again, this time not with soldiers, but with displaced families searching for homes that no longer existed. And yet in that desolation, something extraordinary began to take shape. In the first days of the occupation, Allied commanders expected resentment, sabotage, and chaos. They prepared for riots, for guerrilla resistance. But what they found instead were villages like the one where the chocolate was given, quiet, broken, and yearning for forgiveness. The soldiers who entered these places had seen too much. They had liberated camps, stepped over corpses, and faced the depths of human cruelty. Many had sworn never to trust a German again. But when they saw hungry children and mothers boiling grass for soup, their anger faltered. That hesitation, that small moment when rage met pity, became the fragile beginning of peace. In those early weeks, U.S. Army medics became the first healers of both bodies and souls. They treated the wounds of the defeated, just as they had treated their own men. German civilians who had once hidden in fear now began to appear at medical tents asking quietly for help. And help was given. The same men who had stormed through Normandy were now handing out bandages and milk powder. They repaired water pumps, distributed rations, and helped bury the dead, German and Allied alike. One American unit, stationed near Kassel, even organized a small bakery to feed local children. The ovens had survived the bombing. The flour came from army supplies. Within days, the smell of bread filled the ruins, and for many it was the first true sign that life could continue. But mercy was not always simple. There were arguments in command posts, officers who warned that leniency might weaken discipline, others who feared that compassion would erase accountability for what the Reich had done. The line between forgiveness and forgetting was thin and fragile. Yet among the soldiers on the ground, the choice was rarely ideological. It was human. They had seen enough death to understand that vengeance could not rebuild what had been lost. In letters home, many wrote the same sentiment. They're people, just like us. That realization, born in burned villages and quiet acts of kindness, began to spread. By summer, the American zones of occupation were transforming. Field hospitals became community clinics. Barracks became schools. Engineers rebuilt bridges. Food convoys rolled in from France carrying grain and medical supplies. The enemy was slowly becoming the civilians. For the German people, this mercy was both a blessing and a burden. It forced them to confront the moral wreckage of the Reich, not through punishment alone, but through the shame of being forgiven. It was easier to hate one's conqueror than to be pitied by him. And yet, mercy had a way of cleansing what anger could not. The same soldiers who had seen the worst of humanity were now proving that the human spirit could still rise above its ruins. The small moments, a shared cigarette, a loaf of bread, a doctor's gentle touch, were the first bricks in the reconstruction of Germany's soul. Years later, historians would credit policies and plans by the Marshall Plan, the denazification programs, the rebuilding of Europe. But long before those words were written, the true rebuilding began in moments like that. In a soldier's hand reaching down to lift a child, in a nurse's tears as she treated an enemy's wound, in the quiet realization that peace is not given, it is chosen. That was the legacy of that nameless German town, of the boy with the chocolate, of the men who laid down not just their weapons, but their hatred. Because wars end when armies stop fighting. But peace begins only when hearts decide to forgive. The nurse and the new dawn in. The months that followed Germany's surrender, the town that had witnessed that fragile act of mercy became a quiet outpost of the American occupation zone. Spring turned to summer, and nature, indifferent to the wreckage of war, began to reclaim the ruins. Wildflowers grew between cracks in the pavement. The river that once carried smoke and debris now shimmered under the sunlight. The Americans stayed. Not as conquerors, but as guardians of an uneasy peace. Among them was a small detachment of field medics, the same men who had entered the town on that April day. They set up a temporary infirmary inside what had been a schoolhouse. Its windows were shattered, the blackboard still covered in lessons from years before the war. Yet each day it filled with life again. The groans of the wounded, the cries of infants, the steady voice of men who had seen too much death trying now to preserve life. And it was there that she returned, the German nurse. She had survived the bombings by sheer chance, carrying bandages through the chaos, refusing to flee even when others did. Her uniform was torn, her hands blistered from weeks without rest. She entered the schoolhouse one morning wordlessly and began helping the medics treat civilians. At first, the Americans hesitated. She was the enemy, after all. Her accent, her armband, even her posture carried the weight of the other side. But war has a way of erasing uniforms when wounds are the same color. One of the American doctors, a man who had served since Normandy, handed her a pair of clean gloves and said simply, "Help us." She nodded. For days they worked side by side, binding wounds, setting fractures, comforting children. No one spoke of politics or victory. In that small, dimly lit room there were no victors, only survivors. One afternoon a group of children arrived, escorted by soldiers from a nearby village. Malnourished, frightened, clutching what few possessions they had left, the nurse knelt to examine a boy with a fever. He looked familiar. When he opened his eyes, recognition flickered. The same boy who had once stood trembling in the town square. Chocolate melting in his hand, he smiled weakly and whispered a word in German, "Danke." "Thank you." The nurse froze, tears welling in her eyes. She remembered that day, the soldiers, the silence, the sweetness that had broken the bitterness of war. And now, months later, the same sweetness had returned, not in the taste of chocolate, but in the sound of gratitude. She turned to the American doctor, and for the first time since she had entered, she spoke in halting English. "You saved him. You saved us." The doctor shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "You saved each other." By the end of that summer, the town began to heal. Shops reopened. Bells rang again in churches whose roofs had been rebuilt with Allied timber. Farmers returned to their fields. guided by American engineers who taught them how to repair tractors instead of tanks. The nurse continued to work with the U.S. medics until they were reassigned. On their last day, as the convoy prepared to leave, she stood by the roadside with a few townspeople. The doctor who had given her gloves approached and pressed something into her hand, a ration bar, wrapped in the same brown paper that once carried hope into the ruins. She unwrapped it, smiled, and whispered, "This time, I will share it." She broke the bar into small pieces and gave them to the children around her. The doctor watched quietly, understanding that in that gesture a circle had closed. That town was never famous. No headlines recorded what happened there, but among the soldiers who passed through, it became a kind of whispered legend, a place where war had stopped not because someone surrendered, but because someone cared. Years later, some of those men would return as tourists, standing in that same square, now filled with laughter instead of fear. The fountain was rebuilt, the white flag long gone, and on the wall of the town hall, a small plaque read April 1945, when mercy was stronger than hatred. The story of that day, and the people who lived it, became one of countless moments that defined how the war ended not just militarily, but morally. For every bombed city and every burned bridge, there were acts of compassion that rebuilt the human spirit one gesture at a time. The war had divided nations, but mercy, in its quiet and unrecorded way, began to stitch them back together. And in the ruins of a world that had nearly destroyed itself, a nurse's tears and a soldier's kindness reminded humanity of something essential, that even in war, the smallest acts of goodness can survive the fire. The price of mercy. History often remembers war through its noise, the thunder of artillery, the roar of engines, the speeches of victory. But peace, when it comes, is quiet. It arrives in the silence between gunfire, in the trembling hands that choose to heal instead of strike. The story of that German town was not grand in military terms. No generals were decorated for it. No medals were awarded. Yet it carried within it the seed of something greater than conquest, reconciliation. When an American soldier offered a bar of chocolate instead of revenge, he unknowingly defied the logic of war itself. He acted not as a conqueror, but as a man who remembered what it meant to be human. That moment, small and unrecorded, was the moral victory that every nation longed for but few ever achieved. Because the true measure of civilization is not how fiercely it fights, but how gently it forgives. After 1945, the world faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just cities but trust. Europe's ruins became classrooms for the next generation, teaching that hatred, when fed long enough, devours the hand that holds it. The United States, once seen as an enemy's destroyer, became its partner in rebuilding. Germany, once consumed by fanaticism, became a democracy founded on the memory of what unchecked hatred had done. And behind every treaty, every reconstruction plan, every photograph of smiling children receiving aid, there was an invisible current, the compassion of ordinary men and women who refused to repeat the past. They understood what war had taken, not just lives, but empathy. And they knew what peace demanded its return. Today, when we look at the faded photographs of 1945, the soldiers in dusty uniforms, the children clutching chocolate bars, we are reminded that mercy is not weakness. It is endurance. It survives when ideologies crumble. It outlasts empires. In the end, the victory that mattered most was not written in treaties or maps. It was written in a child's smile, the moment sweetness returned to a bitter world.